have a conversation about that, yes, I'm here. That's what brought me here.
How you doing, Melba? At least I can call you Melba.
Good afternoon, yes.
My name is Marlon Peterson. I'm a social justice fellow, and always looking at the intersection between, intra-community gun violence that we have that's so prevalent, and also the police violence that has always been prevalent. It's just much more in our view, much more visible. And this. So here's the thing, right? So we are, the Alton Sterling incident that happened a couple of days ago. It is like it's been renting a lot of space in my mind the last couple of days, too much space almost. And then, so last night, first time I did a Facebook Live post about, just my thoughts about this whole thing. I don't think I've ever done a Facebook Live post. And, I'm laying in my bed after that's done, and I'm sadly looking at all the news all over the headlines about, everything that's happened, the details that's coming out about the Alton Sterling case, particularly with the baby, his son crying at that press conference. And then I'm laying in my bed, and, I said, let me go on Twitter, because the way I wanted to see if alternate side parking was in effect for the next day to know if I had to move my car. So I'm laying in my bed, so I said, let me do this one last thing, look on alternate side for that. And the first thing I see on Twitter is about hashtag Falcon Heights shooting. Yeah. And I'm saying, what is this? So I'm scrolling, and I see this video, and we've all seen the video, many of you, seen the video of, this horrific, insensitive murder, in my opinion. And then I'm laying in bed thinking about that. So, I eventually fell asleep. I didn't go to sleep. I eventually fell asleep, and I woke up tired. And I didn't eat until I went. God went to the office, and I didn't eat until maybe around 11 this morning. And I wrote a piece about it, and I got that out there. And so I'm here. We're having this conversation about it now. I think people all over this country is having this. All over the world. Funny enough, I just did an interview, a Skype interview with a newspaper in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, about gun violence in general, and they were telling me about what's going on up there in America about the Alton Sterling thing, and I said, well, there's something else that happened, and they didn't, in the studio down there in Trinidad for the newspaper, they hadn't yet, these two particular people who were doing the interview at least didn't hear about the latest incident with Philando, Castile, and then they were like, what's going on with y'all up there in America? Yeah. What's going on with y'all up there? I'm scared to come. One of the interviewers was a black guy. He's like, I don't want to come to this country.
Right. So I actually haven't seen any of it. I haven't seen any of the videos. I saw clips, and I just came back literally last night from a family trip to Mississippi, to Laurel, Jackson, and Wahala, where my family and my husband's families are from. And I remember just being, particularly in Wahala, which is about 30 miles north of Mississippi, having heard about Mr. Sterling, and there just being this kind of heightened just fear, honestly, and being happy that we were moving through Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia before, in certain areas before the sun went down, right? But I'm not saying that about the South, because the reality of it is I'm from Illinois, and the latest Mr. Castile, that happened in Minnesota. This is happening everywhere in our country. And because I work with survivors of torture, I am very mindful. I don't watch CSI anymore. I don't watch Law and Order. I don't watch any of those shows. I'm very mindful of what I'm taking in, so that I can be available to do the work that I'm responsible for in my day to day. But one of the things that made me think about it when you were talking about our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean is, I get to train, for one of my positions, I get to train asylum officers, and I often tell them, trauma happens across that immigration piece, right? People still have the idea that the United States is getting a big chunk in it, like land of gold, right? Home of the free, right? Land of the brave, all of that. I think I said it opposite, but y'all know what I mean. And I talk about how, imagine what it's like if you've been through civil war in Central or Western Africa, or you're a gay man or woman that has paid coyotes to get you to the United States from Central and South America or from the Middle East, right? And then you get here and you're confronted with Black Lives Matter, you're confronted with the day-to-day realities of being black and brown in this country. How unsafe might you feel, right? You think you've been through something, and then you get here to resettle, to be safe, to be free, and you're confronted with all of the things that we've been experiencing, honestly, for the last 4 years, right? I have a 4-year-old, and he was born right before Trayvon Martin was murdered. And my friends would want to have conversations about it. I'd be like, I can't. Like, I have a black baby boy. Like, there's only so much of, I was just acknowledging and honoring that space of avoidance. I think it's, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. It's a healthy part of trauma. It's a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's healthy because it gets you to the next thing. It helps you keep it moving. And we can't stay there. Right? And that's one of the things about Black Lives Matter and some of the other things that folks are doing in conversations, is that we've moved out of avoidance, because that's just only going to take you so far. At an individual level, I'm very much in the, like, I don't want to see the videos. There's something about seeing that stuff over and over again that I think can facilitate the dehumanization of our brothers and sisters. And at the same time, we have to have a space of acknowledgement. I have a sister-in-law that's about to be a senior, and she's talking about going to school in Texas. And I was like, have you heard of Sandra Bland, mm-hmm. my lovely black sister? Like, have you, these are the realities of our day-to-day lives. Of it's not that we can't go to these, or shorten or limit our freedoms. At the same time, we have to be aware. We have to be mindful of our day-to-day realities and how to navigate.
The thing about these day-to-day realities, I constantly think about our young folks, right? So when I see these videos, it's funny, I always get a flashback to Rodney King, for me, because I was about 11, 12, I think, around when that happened. And I always, anytime these incidents happen, I always go back to that. Like, the picture in my mind flips back to that videotape, because at 11, 12, that's the first time I had seen on video that type of police violence. So I think about our babies now and what they're seeing. So when we saw, at the press conference, there's a press conference at the family of Mrs. Sterling that they held yesterday, and they had the 15-year-old son of Mrs. Sterling to the right of, I believe, might have been Sterling's, Alton's sister, I believe, and just uncontrollably and spontaneously he starts crying, and he doesn't start only crying like a tear and sort of measured. It becomes one of those, he can't hold it back, and then he just starts shouting, my daddy, and as boys sometimes, because we have these warped sense of masculinity, we tend to think, well, I'm calling my pops or just my dad or what have you. But when you heard him say my daddy, it was, he couldn't hold back anything at that point, and they eventually, took him off the stage because he was inconsolable. And then now the day after, right? The day after we see, a couple hours after, excuse me, or we see of the incident in Minneapolis with Philando Castile, and there's a 4-year-old girl in the back seat. So she witnesses this person who's a cop, this white person who's a cop, shoot him 4 times. She sees that, she hears the shots, and then after that happens, she sees Philando get hurt, she sees Philando get limp, and she sees Philando die. 4 years old sees those stages. Mm-hmm. Then she sees her mother, the police, one of the officers who along with this cop takes the child out of the car, and this cop is holding this girl. Right? So these people who are in the same uniform are now in a place of trying to upholding this baby child, right? And then another officer orders the mother to get out of the car, who's in the driver's seat, and to walk back, get on the floor, while the daughter is in the background seeing him tell his mother to get down on your knees. The next thing they do is put her in a car, put both of them in the backseat of a police car. I believe the mother was handcuffed, and the baby is right next to her. And the baby is now saying to the mother, "Mommy, I'm here for you, I got you," some along them lines. So, we're thinking about this little child, 4 years old, is doing things that she should not have to do. She's seeing things she should not have to see. And now just imagine to Mr. Alton, Mrs. Sterling's son, who's now probably seeing that same video of that baby girl crying, consoling her mother. Think about how that doubly affects and traumatizes Mrs. Sterling's son, right? And these are like the nuances of what makes it so difficult, and more so that Philando Castile worked in a school in a cafeteria. So think about when these kids see that man see his picture and they see that video, they are now dealing with that. And if they're out of school now, when they return to school in the fall, they will see somebody visibly invisible. He's not there.
Yeah.
And that will be the subject of conversation.
Right. And I think what it's important for us to remember as adults is that we have the greater capacity to cultivate and create spaces of healing for ourselves and for our children. And I think one of the most challenging things that sometimes happen is in our avoidance, right? In our I can't, I don't wanna, rightness, or even sometimes for some people in the sort of disconnect. That's not my people. That's not my, like, I remember right after Ferguson having conversations with people where they were really, and my family happens to be from East St. Louis and St. Louis, so that was another one that hit really close to home. And I had jury duty, so that's a whole other conversation. I'll get there in a second, but because I do think it's relevant when we think about what to do, like the ways in which this is connected. Sometimes one of the most challenging and more harmful things that we as adults do in our ignorance is be silent. And in that, communicate to our children, these aren't things we talk about. In the moments when it is most important for our kids to have a space to talk about.
Here's the thing, I'm wondering, is like as adults, are we actually coping with these things? Are we dealing with it, or are we finding ways to just constantly just finding ways to maybe, if not avoid is the right term, to just like fill up that mess with other things? Because like as adults, like we keep seeing these things over and over again, and so many of us this morning, you look through social media, there's people, they're all, my friends and family are texting me, are you okay, Marlon, etc. I'm not doing too well. And this is going on, I'm sure it's going on with so many black folks around, and others around this country, right? So, like, I don't know, particularly if these things keep happening and visibly, if we are really dealing with it.
Thank you. Right. I think that's a great point. Let me take a step back, right? Because you can't give what you ain't got. So you can't create a space for healing for your child if you have not created a space for yourself. Right, and so that is the first thing of, I talk about being in voice. There was a little bit of shame, a little bit of guilt, but then I was like, no, that's real. And so I think one of the first things that happens is letting go of the shoulds, right? We can be very self-critical, or I should do this, or I should do that, and social media in some ways can cultivate that. But in terms of creating a space of healing, and the healing needs to happen across all levels. It needs to happen at the individual level, it needs to happen at the family, couple level, the community, right, and society. But in order to do that, it has to start here. And the first step, honestly, it's kind of cliche, is awareness. Acknowledging. Even if you're continuing to do it, at least saying, I'm avoiding work because it's triggering for me. So I actually am going to take a step back and do a little bit of psychoeducation about trauma. And it's one of my favorite ways of thinking about it is something called TICES, which you can actually use your hand to remember, which is that for every experience, and I define trauma, it's not the way that the American Psychological Association defines it, and I'll talk about that, the post-traumatic stress disorder, but I think it's a more useful way of describing it. Trauma is anything that is greater than our capacity to cope. Period. Anything that is greater than our capacity to cope. And so what I love about that is it's individual, it's unique. What's traumatic for you may not be traumatic for me. What's traumatic for me today is not what was traumatic to me last week or even yesterday, right? Before Alton Sterling, what's traumatic is different after. So that's the first thing to remember. Trauma is anything beyond our capacity to cope. The shins, which are core I am statements, they're not thoughts, they're core beliefs about the self, which any religion or spiritual belief or atheist will tell you the most powerful thing is the I am. So usually what happens in trauma is people may shift from thinking I am powerful, or I am capable, or I am safe, to I am unsafe, I am powerless, right? So there's core thoughts or about the self that are associated with it. There are emotions. Just like there's anger, there's hurt, there's sadness, there's fear, there's disgust, there's guilt, right? So there are emotions and there are physical sensations. The body tends to remember more than any other part of us, right? And what happens with the traumatic, so I'll go over that again, it's TICES. For every traumatic experience, anything greater than our capacity to cope, there are triggers, images, core beliefs about ourselves, I am statements, emotions, and physical sensations associated with that event. And in order to heal at the individual level, we have to start to be cognizant and mindful and have conversations with ourselves and with each other about all of these areas. Sometimes the most traumatic part of an incident isn't what you would think, right? So for Mr. Sterling's son, it may not be the image. It may be something that was said just before or just after. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, for a lot of people, what's traumatic is who wasn't there when they needed them to be, who didn't show up. People will say about a funeral, you remember who was there. You don't necessarily remember what was said. It's all kind of gobbledygook, but you remember who showed up, who came, who sent a text message, who called, who left a voicemail. You don't remember what they said, you just remember this person checked in on me. And so that's another thing to keep in mind.
It's one of the things I'm thinking about. So, I do work around gun violence, and, I saw one of my Facebook friends at least, posted like, well, why are people getting upset about this sort of thing that's happening? They're not getting upset about, everyday gun violence that's happening. And I come from a place of this, that the violence that we perpetuate against ourselves and our communities, though inexcusable, there's reasons behind it, and that the trauma that we've had inflicted upon us as a community for generations, from people in power, from law enforcement, from the state, in many ways we have been conditioned to mirror that same sort of violence. So that, like, the violence that we perpetrate is not in a vacuum, right?
Right.
And that is equally important to acknowledge this sort of violence, because it's all relatable trauma, right? The trauma that we had from police over the generations hasn't been dismissed. We never dealt with that. There wasn't a national convening, a truth and reconciliation panel or commission that says, well, we got to deal with the type of violence that police are inflicting on people in Harlem in 1935 mm-hmm. or in LA in 1964, right? We never had that, right? So actually, as an expert in this space, do you lift up one sort of experience above the other? Meaning, do you lift up, or should we even? How do we, the experience between community violence, intra-community gun violence particularly, and the police violence? Do you see as interconnections? Should we lift up one above the other?
Right. So we have a saying in sort of the torture space of there is no such thing as a torture Olympics. Right. There's no trauma Olympics. There's no medal that's won by seeing them as either or. Right, in order for it to, because at the end of the day, it's about, I think trauma may be a more sort of effective space and way of thinking about it is from a healing perspective, right? Because whether you're traumatized because of the community violence that was perpetrated, or you're traumatized because of the community violence that's perpetrated at a different level, it's community violence.
It's all community violence, correct.
It's at a different level. It actually rises to the level of torture. From the way that the United States defines torture and the United Nations defines torture. The United Nations looks at it from a human rights perspective. United States looks at it, their laws were actually designed to perpetrate, to pursue and prosecute perpetrators of torture. And they've now had to use it in the sort of asylum spaces and immigration spaces to understand whether or not the experience of survivors meets a torture experience. But not to get too caught up in it, but it's important to understand that torture is a form of trauma. It is state-sanctioned trauma. It is when the state or the government has perpetrated trauma against somebody, violated their so in that space, it's all trauma. And I don't think that it is helpful to start to think of them as either or. And in similar ways, I think that it's also, keeping that in mind while we're talking about the 2 lives that were taken from us by police more recently. The reality of it was Orlando was a black and brown
absolutely
massacre, right? Mm-hmm. And so some of that, I think when it comes to healing, we need to start really thinking about how do we come together as a community? How do we let go of some of the messages that we promote about different parts of our community, be they Muslim, be they gay, be they lesbian, be they women, be they children, right? Because some of that rhetoric is what's getting in the way of us truly coming to a place where we can heal beyond the individual. Mm-hmm. And in order for any of this to really be transformed, we have to start with the individual. And there's a lovely quote that I don't have with me about environmental justice, so I'm going to mess up the name, but I'm not going to, and I'm going to give the quote in a different way. I'm not going to directly quote her, but she talks about, like, when you think of healing justice, a parallel would be environmental justice. It is not sufficient, right? It's necessary for people to recycle, but it's not sufficient. You need environmental policies. You need groups, you need communities to have active ways in which they are addressing environmental justice. So often when we talk about healing justice, it gets narrowed to the individual. Oh, black people need to be more open to mental health. Black people need to go find a therapist. Well, the reality of it is there's so few black mental health professionals that can't be the only way we heal. And the conversation has to include the individual, but we also have to start thinking about families and community, the media. Honestly, one of the differences in this trauma is that it's a stressor that just keeps coming. Both in the event, but also in the 24/7. I had a friend that was like, she had protected herself, right? But she forgot to log off of Facebook. And she was like, that should have been where I started, right? Like, there are these triggers that are constant and ever coming.
But even with, like, say, the Daily News, I believe, has a cover, and this is the thing about, they previewed the cover on social media yesterday, right? And I saw it, and the Daily News ain't listening to me, but I sent a tweet back to them, like, please do not print this, right? Of course, they printed it, and it's a cover of Mr. Sterling, bloodied on the floor, dead, laying limp on the ground. And their reason behind it is just awareness. But you don't have to buy that newspaper. You could just walk down the street anywhere, if you're in New York City, or just be scrolling along your Facebook page, wherever it is, and just see that image of that. And my thing is, like, not only, here's the thing about trauma in that space, is that it's also removing the dignity of this individual. Right? So you may say there's awareness, but where's the dignity? Like, that's the picture that, for some people, that is the only image of that human being. For most of us, that's the only image of that human being we will ever see. Right.
And it's dehumanizing, and it's awareness for what purpose, right? Because we were talking about this earlier with Emmett Till. There was a conscious civil rights activist purpose.
And his mama did.
And his mother made that conscious civil rights activist purpose. That was the rationale for showing Emmett Till's face. She did that with conscientiousness, and she gave permission, and it had a purpose. Awareness for the general public, to what ends? It's not therapeutic. When you heal from trauma, some people come in and they don't want to say anything about what they experienced. Other people come in and they spill. And they're both just sort of opposite ends of the same spectrum, neither of which are healing. Because in order to really heal, and that's the first place that you really have control, is over managing our triggers. You got to sort of take it in bites. Part of what's happened is it's too much for the brain to digest all of this. So you do it like you would a meal, right? And that's the other metaphor, analogy. You're the writer. When we are traumatized, it's like when we eat too much, right? And we have too much to digest, and we're not able to take out what's good for us, what can help us, what can move us forward, what can make us stronger, and what we need to just throw away as waste. And that's what happens to the brain when we're traumatized.
I woke up dizzy.
Exactly. It's too much for our brains to digest. So really, in order to digest it, we need to take those triggers in bite-sized moments. To undercut that avoidance. Yes, do it, but to just sort of go binging on social media or the newspaper, all these things, that's not gonna get us to a healthy space. But being conscientious, when I do trauma processing with our clients, first of all, you develop the coping skills, you develop the safe spaces to talk to people, right? I'm not sure what that would look like, and that's where there's some brainstorming available around the community, collective space, but you develop, like, the capacity to breathe, the capacity to calm yourself down, and then you sit with it. And I might say, come on, let's just talk about this moment for 5 or 10 minutes, 15 minutes most. And at 15 minutes, we're going to end. And we're going to go do something that feels good. We're going to go water a plant. We're going to go call a friend. You're going to go take a walk, right? And that's really what's wrong with, in my opinion, the Daily News blasting it, is that it becomes another trigger because
and there's no context for it.
And there's no context for it. There's no space. There's no shutting it down. They're not even hosting, are they even hosting a meaningful conversation about it? Are they even articulating that rationale? Because otherwise...
I'm sorry, I want to cut in because you mentioned New York Daily News, and I just went to look at their Twitter. They pinned a tweet that they tweeted about 30 minutes ago that says, just in, Alton Sterling bought a gun just hours before he was shot dead by police.
Right.
That's the latest story that they're running and that they have pinned to the top of their Twitter account. I'm sorry.
To what end?
Exactly. And so
it makes sense. That's why they killed him, right? For what? To what end?
It's not a life. That's not a life-threatening short. I mean, one of my colleagues said, "Where's the NRA?" Right? Where's the NRA saying when people, if you're in a state with open carry, you should be safe. It should not lead to the end of your life. And so,
and they pinned it. So so when you go to their Twitter, you're going to see that. You're going to see that thing. And almost to sort of once again to filter our thoughts that somehow he was deserving of death. Right? He was deserving of that. The fact that he could have born a nuclear bomb 2 hours ago. At that moment, they didn't know that. That's the first thing. The second thing is he was a human being. Does that justify somebody laying on top of you, and then killing you at point blank range? And it's so far, people have already dug into Philando Castile's background, and sadly they weren't able to find that he has some huge record, he didn't do this sort of thing. But the point is so what if he did, right? And as you mentioned with the NRA, so where he was at, he was a licensed carrier of a weapon. According to his girlfriend, he told them, listen, officer, I'm a licensed carrier of a weapon, just so that you know. So he did everything he's supposed to. That is what NRA trained you to do, right? If you're stopped by police, mind you, he was stopped because they said he had a broken taillight. Right? That's a whole other story in and of itself. But he followed the instructions. They asked him to give him his license and registration. He was about to do that, and they took his life. So let's just say hypothetically, for the sake of this conversation, for this argument, he had some sort of past, some sort of background where he got in trouble with the law, etc. In that moment, in that instance, and even paralleling this to in Baton Rouge, I just forgot I went blank on the brother's name, Mr. Sterling. Paralleling that, at that moment, they don't know that about that person. They just see him. They see a black person. They don't know all the background, unless they assume there's a unconscious bias or conscious bias that they have that this person more than likely is dangerous. He has something. For instance, I'll give you a story, and this I wrote about this and I made a whole big issue about it several months ago. I was driving home. I live in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. I'm driving home, and for that day I had a rental. It was a 2016 rental. This was in October of 2015. It was a rental. That's the car they gave me. And it's about 10 o'clock at night. I'm driving home, and police pull me over. At the time, I had on a hat like this, but I had a hoodie on in my car. He pulls me over and, tells me to put down my window, put the car in drive. I do exactly that. And the next question he asked me is, are you on parole or probation? And I was like, no, I'm not on parole or probation. The next question he asked me is this your car? I said, well, it's a rental. Of course he knew that because I'm sure they looked at my plates already. He said, give me the registration and et cetera. I give him my license. I give him the car, the rental agreement. He proceeds to take it back. He comes to me, and for the audience, if you don't know, I'm somebody who did spend time in prison, but years ago. He comes to me, mind you, he still hasn't told me what he is stopping me for. Still hasn't. Time is passing. He comes back to me and says, wait, you were arrested for you were convicted of assault in the first degree. I said, that was like 16 years ago. Wow. And then he says, well, if everything else turns up right with your license, we'll let you go. Mind you, the man still hasn't told me why he stopped me. Eventually, after all this, they asked me all these questions back and forth about my past, he says, oh yeah, but let me tell you why we stopped you. We stopped you because you switched. This is, if you know, like some of these single lane streets in Bed-Stuy, we stopped you because you switched lanes without signaling.
Come on now.
Right? So, but here's the thing about that, right? Those are the everyday microaggressions, the everyday violence, right? That's literally a violence act. So that like we deal with. So if you go back to Eric Garner, like he said, not today. Like you ain't doing this to me. You ain't gonna be bothering me today, right? And in many ways, that is how, and sadly, I think in a very rational way, we react at those moments. Mm-hmm. So thankfully, God, thank you that I'm here and I didn't, I'm still alive, I'm living and I'm breathing. But when those things happen over a period of time in our communities, our folks, and over generations, because we pass that down to our kids when we have that talk. You know when the police stop you. Like, we pass that down to our kids through generations, that everyday violence. So in some cases, it makes sense that we react, right? It's not, you may say it's not the smart decision because you want to survive the moment, but it's almost natural that you will react in a way when law enforcement comes at you any sort of way. When you have these everyday interactions, because it's not human to be feeling that way. It's not right.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And I think part of what you were saying about the not human to be feeling, I'm just going to pick up on that and come back, is that, I've had people say what's scary. I think I read an article where someone was saying what was scary to them was that they were numb, that they weren't, that they could no longer feel, they had reached their limit in terms of that. But absolutely, that's part of the thing of survival, right? And when we're traumatized, when something happens that's greater than our capacity to cope, right? Like, who knows what your day had been like before then? If you had been on a day where you weren't able to get to a safe, calm space, but you were agitated and annoyed because of life happening as it is, right? Then, like I said, like part of the work is having it take longer to get to the end of our rope, or take longer to get on our last nerve. Because once we get to our last nerve or the end of the rope, things are happening automatically. We're angry automatically. And unfortunately, as Black and brown people, that makes us unsafe in these encounters when we're dealing with other people who are also being fed the same imagery and violence, right, and have weapons. I think one of the most toxic part of the United States is that combination of fear and guns, right? It's that is really what is happening. That police officer became afraid. Somebody told him it was a gun, and because that's what we're designed to do as human beings. We react without thinking. It literally skips the thinking part of our brain when we get beyond our capacity to cope.
So, you're interesting, and we spoke about this before, but like you're leaping into, like, what was that officer's mind state, right? And I want to, your assessment of this, because we're now in a position, or not, some people may suggest that we need to be thinking about, well, how do we get those folks to also deal with all the trauma that they've, because the trauma is not monolithic. It's not just Black and brown people who are on one side of it. Like, these white folks also are, there's a pathology with the way that they view us, right, in many cases, right? So putting Black and brown folks in a position of having to deal with our own stuff, and now we got to figure out and deal with their stuff. Like, how does that work? First of all, is that a place that we should be in?
Right. And that's a challenge, right? And I'll also add this little anecdote, because, and to shout out to my husband, but he was riding out, he had a very similar story in Park Slope, Brooklyn, with a Black cop. And he got a ticket. And it just so happens that my benefits include that legal thing, and I signed up for it the first time, but we are always conscious of, like, what if we didn't have those resources? This brother, what if he didn't have a job to go to court and fight these battles on this BS ticket that he got, right? So you're right, it's not just Black, white, it's not Black and brown. And there's also that, like, to what degree should the oppressed be responsible for educating the privileged and the oppressor?
As Jesse Williams said something along them lines, right? We shouldn't have to worry about fixing those folks or anything like that. But some people may say that, we should be thinking about them too. I am not one of those people necessarily, right? Not one of the people necessarily, but what do we say to those sort of
I'll
folks?
put it like this. So one of the things that I get to do, and I'll be doing it next week, is a privilege walk, right? And it's this exercise where you put a line of people and they're holding hands, and they're all in one line, and then by the end of the exercise, it gets stratified by race. Well, it gets stratified by privilege, with questions like, if your family owned their home, take a step forward. If your family immigrated here, take a step back, right? And it stirs up a lot of ish. And what you start to see is that the oppressed in this context, and mind you, all of these people are people who have their MDs, their master's degrees, their what have you, right? And even in that room, so you're being stratified with your peers, more or less, whatever that means. And what you start to see is that the oppressed have a much better view of the oppressor. They can see everything that's going on. And those privileged people are incredibly blind. So I'm not going to, I don't know if the word is should, that's challenging for me, but I will just own it and say that I have a hard time imagining a way of having meaningful transformation without those blind people with privilege dealing with them. And they're not all white, right?
But should they be dealing with it by themselves? That's what I'm saying.
They can't. They can't. There's a wonderful RuPaul quote that I have been living from for months, and I'm not going to say it because my mother might see this or my father, but I'll just give the words. He said,
They
said, surround yourself with smart MFs, right? And don't bother with stupid MFs, because don't waste your time trying to educate them. It's a lose-lose situation. I agree with that. However, I do think there's a difference between stupidity and ignorance. And I just cannot, you need that privilege. You need the power that comes with that privilege to truly shift things. I will say, like, I get sick, and I've called out some institutions about, why am I the person teaching the race, culture, and ethnicity class? You need a white man up in here teaching this class. Because what people get from it depends on who's speaking to them, and some people just aren't going to get it unless it's coming from somebody who looks like them. At the same time, I don't think we as black and brown people can just throw our hands up and be like, oh, he's so ignorant, he's so privileged, I'm so sick of him and his white privilege, or her and her white privilege, that I'm just gonna just leave him alone and hang out with my peeps, or people. That's, you're right. I don't think that's gonna get it. I don't think that's gonna shift things in the way that they need to be shifted. So I think it's a matter of safety for some of us to be engaged in conversations and calling people out and saying, look, because the reality of it is, I worked with some therapists who, and we had this conversation because she was talking about feeling guilty. And I was saying, guilt doesn't really get you anywhere. The reality of it is, folks with privilege have access to resources that those of us who don't have that particular kind of privilege just don't. And we need those resources. So those kinds of collaborations, we need to find a way to have some of those, just so that they see how connected their experience is to these day-to-day realities. As long as that jury room that I sat in, the person that was suing someone because the door opened on a car, and he was an undocumented immigrant trying to get to work, and he got hit by a car door, and he sued because he couldn't work because he was injured. He couldn't ride his bike, he couldn't do the deliveries. And one of the jurors said, he just needs to go back to his home country where it's warmer, so then he won't experience these pains when it's cold.
Wow.
Right. And the beauty, the one that she kept coming back to, was, why wasn't his boss here to testify on his behalf? And mind you, when they picked me for this jury, I said, I do have a bias towards immigrants. But I was in the room. This isn't just to my own home, but this is the reality of the kinds of conversations that can be had of, like, I have the right to vote. I can sit on a jury. That man, as an undocumented immigrant, cannot. So to say to this woman, so you expect the man who hired an illegal immigrant to take time off of his job to come to court and testify on behalf of the under-the-table employee that he has, right? That's the level of ignorance and privilege. And that kind of ignorance and privilege, as long as it stands, there's only so much meaningful shifting. You need somebody in the police, right? We need somebody on police willing to have these kind of courageous conversations, willing to say, hey, these officers aren't getting any kind of care for the trauma they experience. They're being told the strong officer doesn't cry, the strong officer doesn't experience PTSD. That's problematic. As long as that's the conversation,
yeah, and so
all of us are
here,
unsafe.
on Facebook, I'm hoping that this is in the same line of what you were talking with the immigrant that you experienced, but the idea of this Alton Sterling with 5 children, his oldest being 15 years old, and he was trying to make a living selling something that's as antiquated as CDs. Think about the idea of that. The privilege, the non-privilege behind Alton having to do this as a father of 5.
Right.
And trying to make money. Like that itself is enough. And you, Marlon, mentioned earlier Philando as a cafeteria worker. Can you just talk about that, since we're in the conversation of privilege and those things?
Yeah, so that inserts the complexities. First of all, complexities is, so this problem, this trauma that we're speaking about is multi-layered, right? Yeah. It's multifaceted. So, in the case of Mr. Sterling, not only with antiquated business of selling CDs, but they might have been bootleg DVDs, CDs, or whatever all that is, right? So he's always, so he's taking risks as it stands. He's taking these risks, maybe. Suddenly, I'm just assuming that there might have been some bootleg DVDs in there. And excuse me if they're not. But he's still taking these risks to do that, right? To engage in that sort of business, as it were, to take care of his family or contribute to his family. And his family more than likely understands the risk that he's taking to go do these sort of things. They're not in a position of maybe security in the sense if you're selling CDs. It's not the best job in the world, et cetera. There's no benefits that comes along with that. There's no health insurance that comes along with that sort of job. There's no job security that comes along with that job. But he's doing something, right?
Right.
So now, as he's taken away from them. Not only is this person taken away from financially from the family and contributing to the family, because that's a residual effects of this situation, right? His family now has to deal with one less person that's able to contribute to the family, to these 5 children. I don't know if he had a partner as well, but definitely to those 5 children. And then going back to Philando Castile. I don't know if the daughter in the backseat of the car, if the girl in the backseat of the car was his daughter. I'm not sure if that was his daughter. But he was probably he was in the lives of many young people, right? In terms of him working in the cafeteria in the school, he was in the lives of many people who probably looked up to him in many different ways because he was in a safe place of a school building, in the lunchroom where you break bread with folks. And now that's sort of that's taken away from that experience in the school.
Right.
So and that's sort of to the multi-layered problems, multi-layered traumatic effects of this particular experience with these 2 cases. And we'll probably in the next couple of days find out more about these families, et cetera, and everybody and everything that's connected to them. But in a conversation of privilege, these folks are not in the position of the privilege that we understand. They're not in those spaces to even make some of the decisions that some of us maybe can make, right? To decide what sort of job that we want. All right. So this state violence compounds that level of disenfranchisement that they're already experiencing.
Right. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of that's why I say you can't just leave the privilege alone, write them off as ignorant, and keep it moving. Because those men, they had a much better sense of what they were working against than the people who were perpetuating those systems. So what I say about that is, as long as we see, it's not an accident, right? It's not an accident that over 90% of the people in our jail systems are black and brown. Mm-hmm. That's not an accident. It is very much directly related to class, and it does have intergenerational effects. And it's also related to class in terms of the police as well. When you look at those institutions and what those institutions provide, and I started talking about this, but most working class people do not have the resources to really sit back and think about how they're thinking and feeling. They got to go to work, and they got to go to that next job. And the same thing with the police is most of those institutions, our child welfare institution, our police institutions, they do not provide, as an organization, most of those organizations are not providing space for the humanity of the people who work for them. They're not. And then we compound that by otherizing ourselves. And as long as we're otherizing people because of class, because of race, because of occupation,
the neighborhood we live in,
because of the neighborhoods we live in, and I'm guilty of this. I too live in Best, and I live on a block that is rapidly gentrifying, and I'm like, those people, even though, mind you, I was part of the first, if not second or third wave of it's not like I'm not part of that gentrification. But then certain people come in, and I'm like, they're not like me. And what bothered me really was the fact that there was this person on the block, she would get out of the car and go straight to her house and not speak to anyone until the block started changing color. And then she started speaking to those people. But the rest of us she was scared of. As long as we have those kinds of divisions, then we're not going to see, right? Middle class folks aren't going to look at somebody selling CDs or videos. There are people who, in my community, some of the communities I'm connected to, who are like, you went to that neighborhood? Had you known what part of St. Louis that was, you wouldn't have gone over there. What is that, right? That's a way of disconnecting. That's a way of seeing Eric Gardner or Sandra Bland as different from me in some way, shape, or form. And it perpetuates that dehumanization. So I think there is, I'm not sure what to say other than noticing that. I do want to put this piece on there too, because this often doesn't get talked about in our community. There is a bit of a gender thing happening. It's my understanding, and I could be wrong with my facts, that a lot of the black men who are killed in sort of in these really dehumanizing ways that are based on some living life all of a sudden becomes a crime that's punishable by murder. right? Getting their job done, taking care of their families, driving down the street, going from home to work, all of a sudden becomes a crime that is worthy of the death penalty. Like a friend of mine wrote like 24 things that you could be killed for if you're black, wearing a hoodie, right? That kind of stuff. Women are killed when they're calling the police for help. Mental health issues, and they're tapping into other stereotypes that we have about black women as angry and wild and this and that, right? And being out of control, either because their families perceive them that way or their families are looking for help, and then the police come, misperceive, and that's punishable by death. So I'm not sure if that's related to the question, but I do want to put that on there, that there's some different dynamics when you put gender into the conversation about Black Lives Matter.
Well, so I'm happy you brought that into the conversation, actually, because I think about, I'm sorry, I still don't know the name of the girlfriend of Mr. Philando Castile.
Diamond is what I saw.
Diamond?
Yeah.
And here's the thing about Diamond, if that's her name, if that's the correct name. Like, she was on Facebook Live while this was all happening. The officer had her, told her to keep her hands first on the steering wheel, and somehow she must have had the phone in her hands. Throughout the whole ordeal, she's using Facebook Live to report about what's happening, while this cop still has a gun pointed on a dead person's body, right? And easy can just move it a couple meters to the left or to the right, and put a bullet in her too if she moves, if she jumps or what have you. And it speaks to like the amazing courage and sacrifice that Diamond, but it's sort of, indicative like of black women who have been able to be able to sort of put themselves second, sadly, to sort of like take care of the community.
So there was no mourning as it was happening.
But that's the thing, like she was doing this when I saw the video for the first time, and she was still saying things like, okay, sir, you shot him, sir. Like, she's still, like, oh, she just killed somebody she cares for. He just killed somebody she cares for. She was still responding respectfully, right? And to me, in my mind, I just don't know if I can do that. I don't know, but I don't know if that speaks to her numbness to these situations. Maybe she's experienced similar things before, or from vicarious trauma, she's sort of become numb to these sort of things. I don't know what to attribute that to.
I mean, I think for all of us, again, it comes back to this notion that as human beings, we are part of the animal kingdom, and we will do whatever it takes in that moment to survive. And it is so uniquely tailored to each and every one of us what we do to survive. It depends on the person, it depends on the context, it depends on everything they've experienced up to that moment. If you have been trained on how to interact with the police, then it's going to come to you more quickly and easy. That's why you have people do role plays when you're teaching them new skills, is so that when they need it, it's there automatically.
But where, and so speaking about, women, there's a baby girl in the back seat, and I mentioned how the baby girl consoles her mother, like, hey, mommy, I got you, it's going to be okay. Where does a 4-year-old girl, like, she's like taking on this, this cliche of like the strong black woman at 4 years old, right? Like, where does that come from? And where would something like that come from a 4-year-old baby, where she just witnessed a murder, right? She's seen her mother being cuffed and put in the backseat of her car, yet still in a warp where she's a calm one at 4 years old.
Well, I mean, there's also, kids have a greater capacity to heal than we do, and I'm not saying she was healed or anything like that. What I'm saying is there are 3 different basic trauma reactions: fight, flight, or freeze. Playing dead, right? Dinner with Schmucks, I think, gives a good example of that. That actually will help you survive, to play dead, to fight, to freeze. And so that element of yes, officer, there is a level of that is freezing, and then the Facebook is fighting, right? For the little girl, she's there with somebody she knows and loves, who she's been with all of her life. So life happens. She's probably experienced her mother stressed out or having challenges before. And so she's just going to that. She probably did not have any sense of the reality of what had actually happened, right? So there's that part of it too, of like where a young girl learns something like that. It could just be, this is mommy. I feel safe and secure with mommy wherever we are. And it's a testimony to her as a woman, as a parent, that she's done her job in terms of creating a safe space for her child to be able to turn to her and say that. I wouldn't assume that the child has been parentified or any of that. Just in that moment, in that traumatic moment when things are beyond capacity to cope, people are going to go to the things that have helped them survive in other situations. And it's usually not until they look back over that experience, when they have the time and space. Some people don't do relaxation really well. They don't do mindfulness and all that stuff really well, because once they relax, all of the stuff they've been avoiding by keeping themselves busy at work, by drinking that alcohol, by staying out with friends, comes flooding back in, and they don't have the capacity to really cope with those things. Each of us has a very unique way. One of the things I will say about our children really are resilient. And if they do get capacity, so when you're talking about the schools, okay? I think that just as there's trauma, there has to be healing and resilience. There has to be healing and recovery. It serves none of us, right? What I often tell people when we start working as torture when I start working with trauma survivors, really, it's not just torture survivors. And I learned it actually in couples therapy, was our job as therapists is to
torture.
Just that by the time a couple, particularly a couple of color, comes to therapy, it's like, our job is simply to rehopify. Mm-hmm. Our job is to simply remind people that there is hope, that this is difficult. It's not to deny, dismiss. It's not to recuse the perpetrator and said that what they did was okay. It's not to come out with the cliches that everything happens for a reason. It's not any of that. It's to simply remind people that as difficult as it is, as painful as it is, you'll get through it. It's hard and you can do it. It's difficult and it can be done.
Sorry to cut you. We have a few minutes left because I know you have a time.
Yeah.
But President Obama has released a statement in the time that we've been sitting here. And I hope that you guys can hear me on the other side of the Facebook Live. But it's a long statement, but they do want you guys to address it from Facebook Live. All Americans should be deeply troubled by the fatal shootings of Alton, Sterling, and Baton Rouge, and Philando, Castile, and Falcon Heights, Minnesota. We've seen such tragedies far too many times, and our hearts go out to the families and communities who've suffered such a painful loss. Although I am constrained in commenting on the particular facts of these cases, I am encouraged that the U.S. Department of Justice has opened a civil rights investigation in Baton Rouge, and I have full confidence in their professionalism and their ability to conduct a thoughtful, thorough, and fair inquiry. But regardless of the outcome of such investigations, what's clear is that these fatal shootings are not isolated incidents. They are symptomatic of the broader challenges within our criminal justice system, the racial disparities that appear across the system year after year, and the resulting lack of trust that exists between law enforcement and too many of the communities they serve. To admit we've got a serious problem in no way contradicts our respect and appreciation for the vast majority of police officers who put their lives on the line to protect us every single day. It is to say that, as a nation, we can and must do better to institute the best practices that reduce the appearance or reality of racial bias in law enforcement. That's why 2 years ago, I set up a task force on 21st century policing that convened police officers, community leaders, and activists. Together, they came up with detailed recommendations on how to improve community policing. So even as officials continue to look into this week's tragic shootings, we also need communities to address the underlying fissures that lead to these incidents and to implement those ideas that can make a difference. That's how we'll keep our communities safe. And that's how we can start restoring confidence that all people in this great nation are equal before the law. Last paragraph. In the meantime, all Americans should recognize the anger, frustration, and grief that so many Americans are feeling. Feelings that are being expressed in peaceful protests and vigils. Michelle and I share those feelings. Rather than fall into a predictable pattern of division and political posturing, let's reflect on what we can do better. Let's come together as a nation and keep faith with one another in order to ensure a future where all of our children know that their lives matter. Mm-hmm. How do you guys feel about that?
Well, I'm going to say as tempered as that statement is, there will inevitably be people who will say he's the president and he should not be involved in these issues, right? There are people who will, people on the right who will say that. My thing about this, about his issue, about his statement, and from what I've read, what you stated is, one, in some ways, when he says, it's for the community to sort of deal with these fissures with law enforcement, it's almost putting it upon the community, us, to fix this, right? As if we're the problem. I just think even with his 21st century policing commission that he put together, and I know some folks on it. Here's the thing that I think is missing, and from his perspective of who he is, and from his pulpit, from his bully pulpit that he has, is that there needs to come a time when we say, like, policing is the problem, and not necessarily the community. We need to work on police-community relations.
Yeah.
Like, policing is a problem, and I think ultimately, going forward, and some work out, and theorizing, hopefully the application of it comes through, that we need to be thinking about ways to minimize our interaction with law enforcement in our communities. Understandably so, we have issues of crime and domestic violence in our communities. But there are examples, and of organizations and people across this country who are not fully reliant upon law enforcement to create, like what I like to say, who are working to create the communities that we want. Right? Because I would say, ultimately, as long as you have somebody who has a terminal weapon, somebody who can be judge and jury in one moment, in one instant, and has a bias, unconscious or conscious bias, like, these things are going to keep happening, right? Like, you can't necessarily train your way out of it.
Right. So, yeah, I agree with the piece about who needs to take what kinds of responsibilities. What I think is helpful is having the president acknowledge it and articulate it, right? Because people are talking about their organizations are silent on this. So I think that piece is important, right? Because trauma happens at all these different levels, particularly, and is perpetuated by policy and social policies and things like that, you need to have somebody at least articulating that. What I was missing, and I don't know enough, I've heard about the 21st Policing Committee. I'm like, there's no mental health aspect to it. I'm biased as a psychologist. As a community psychologist, it's about person and environment fit. So clinical is individual, but community is person environment fit. It's about looking at the effect of the community, of social policy on the individual. And so having somebody who's talking about that, and I agree with you, I think institutionally, the institution of the justice as an institution, right?
Justice system
as an institution, the policing system as an institution needs to take responsibility, needs to stop saying these are a few bad apples. While we acknowledge that the majority of the force is sort of working, and it's like this in most institutions, it's the 10% that take up 90% of the time of most institutions, be they academic, be they work, whatever. They need to put some serious resources towards those 10% or whoever they are, and taking responsibility as organizations. It is my understanding, as an organization, these institutions are not addressing the mental health of their workers. They're not creating healthy cultures in their organizations. They're allowing certain things that then you can either be passively against me or actively for me, right? Like, if you're not actively for me, you're passively against me. Are you creating cultures where people are actively calling their peers out on racist, homophobic jokes and things like that they're saying? And it's my understanding that most of these policing institutions do not have the fundamental things that are necessary to cultivate the humanity of the police officers. And as long as that's not being attended to, as long as that's not part of the responsibility, as long as the focus is about the relationship between the community and the police versus the sort of beliefs and systems and relationship between police officers that are problematic, that are getting cultivated, then things are only going to go so far. You're just going to keep hearing it. It might slow down. It may not happen as often. It may not last as long. But until you start to fundamentally address those unconscious and conscious biases, start to really understand how they're activated and moving and shaping the organization, there's only so much that's going to happen in community.
Well, I mean, we're talking about a fruit of a poisonous tree, right? And in our law, we know about in the American justice system, there's a term called the fruit of a poisonous tree. And ultimately, we have to think of law enforcement as fruit of a very poisonous institution and foundation, and it keeps bearing the same fruit no matter what we do. And it's it's endemic. Particularly, the only nation that has many like police homicides, citizen homicides is South Africa, right? Interesting enough, where they had something, they also had an apartheid as we've had here in this country, and still by de facto in many ways. when incidents happen, let's for instance, and I made this comment a couple of weeks ago, like when incidents happen, when there's somebody who happens to be of Islamic background and they, engage in some sort of activity that's harmful, whether it be terrorists or otherwise, the media and officials, government officials push Muslims. You all need to speak out against this. You need to disavow yourself from this. You need to do more to speak against this sort of violence that people who are of your same faith are perpetrating. When will we have people who are in law enforcement, government, police, officials, people in power? We have, throughout this country now do the same thing. Disavow, speak against the violence of police. Because what they will do is say, well, just a couple bad apples, we need to wait until an investigation comes out, or while the jury made their decision, we just have to go by the jury decision. That's the process that we take over time. And because we become okay with that sort of the way that modus operandi, that procedure of police are not acknowledging their own problems, we keep seeing the same thing happen again and again. Whether it be pundits on TV or whether it be folks in offices who are law enforcement, they need to be able to step out and speak against this violence within their own, in their institutions publicly, and not wait until, well, was he convicted? All right, well, he wasn't convicted, so we know it's not really a big deal.
Right.
That's a problem. Because then it really wasn't a problem.
And that's where I'm talking about being linked to organizational policies, right? Both implicit and explicit. What happens when people take vacation? What happens when people lose a loved one? What happens when people take a mental health day? What happens when somebody actually calls somebody out, either in the moment, right? Because the truth of the matter, in each of these incidents, the most powerful person to have shifted things differently would have been that police officer that wasn't holding the gun, right? Would have been that police officer that was still in the car, on the radio, or had his arm, right? Those are the people who, and so that's where my head goes, is what kind of resources are available for people to courageously, or as a colleague of mine used to say, carefrontate their colleague and say, hey, can I just talk to you? I heard you say something the other day that's a little bit, right? Yeah. And start to understand that what, we're saying these names, these 580 something names, is it this year, right? That's a big number. But what happens is people start to they don't see it as big part of this bigger collective. And again, at the risk of sounding cheesy or cliche, no, really, it starts right here. It starts with those police officers. It starts with those good officers, right? If you want, right, having those conversations.
Going viral. Nakia Jones, she's an officer at Warrensville Heights, Ohio, and she had enough, and she spoke out, and there's a video, and shameless plug if you guys want to look at it. It is on the Roots Facebook page as well as on the Root.com, but she is the one of God knows how many million.
She's a black officer, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Police officers who are in this world, and she spoke out. I don't know what's going to happen to her.
Exactly. Right. And know that she's not the only one, right? Know that there are probably as hundreds of thousands of officers who think and feel the same way, but don't feel safe enough to share it, or don't feel resourced enough. Talk about that I am, right? Don't feel capable enough, resourced enough, whatever the word is, to feel like they can really shift something in that system.
Well, here's the thing, even with her, I haven't watched the video, but one of the bylines for the video is that, so I think she says, I now see what you all are seeing. And to me, that doesn't make me feel good, right? That it takes this, that it took Alton Sterling, or the quick succession of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile for you to say, oh, I now see what you all been seeing. I now see what you all been seeing for all these years. It's once again, and this is this is the ideology in terms of white supremacy, and the ideology is a dismissing of our feelings and our experiences.
Yep.
It's a constant dismissal that these things are real, that we've been seeing this, that it hurts me. And to say now that you finally visibilized us, it wasn't Freddie Gray, it wasn't Sandra, it wasn't Rakia, it wasn't Oscar Grant, it wasn't none of those folks. It was these, because of the succession of it, and because of the particular graphic nature of seeing this man bloody that made it happen?
No, because again, imagine if I'm a police officer, there's a certain level, right, that I got to be able to be at to operate. So I come back to the shoulds and being mindful of our shoulds, because it's our shoulds that lead us to sort of being stuck. Right, I hear what you're saying, and I get your anger, and you're right. That's part of our way of surviving, is those microaggressions. We don't necessarily say anything. We deny to ourselves that hurt, or that was uncomfortable. She got to the end of her rope. She got to her last nerd, and that's when things shifted and she got it. I have a professor at Howard, Dr. Jules Terrell. It's been a couple of decades since I finished Howard, but I got to see him about a couple of weeks ago, and I said, can I get your syllabus on your class, Psychology of Race and Racism? He teaches the class at Howard on race and racism, and I read the first page, and one of the things he said was, every semester, I try not to teach this class again. I think that it's not going to be relevant. But in the context of Black Lives Matter, I find myself once again teaching a class on race and racism and the physiological effects and the ideologies and the microaggressions and the history and all of it that it's linked to. There's still a level of denial, of collective denial, that we all sort of live in. And you're right, these two back to back with the graphic nature and the immediacy of social media and it being summertime, which means that there are things that we're just a little bit more attuned to, I think, in the summer than we are when we're in that workaday and in those cold weather and all that kind of stuff. It's like we're vulnerable in ways, we're taking it in ways that we haven't before. So I hear what you're saying, and I also get the wait, okay, I get it in a new and different way. Because again, trauma is anything that's beyond our capacity to cope. So when it's happening in Louisiana and I'm from Iowa, I don't necessarily get it the way that I do when it's happening in Minnesota across the state line from me, or it's, the area that I just drove through the other day with my family. It's like the context changes, a post from a friend. That's why I don't unfriend my ignorant. I went to a school that was 99% white. I don't unfriend. They may have unfriended me, but I don't unfriend them because I may be the only Black person they know, and they need to know. My white classmate that's sitting in Arizona, who she needs to know. She needs to know that these are the reality. Why? Because she can vote. She can vote in Arizona. For all I know, her daddy goes golfing with the senator or with the representative. You never really know who those degrees of separation and who has access to your story, your point of view, and what they can do with that information.
And I'm sorry to cut you guys, but I know that Ms. Doctor has somewhere to be, and we do need to wrap up. And the whole point of this was to share and to have a conversation around what's going on. And I know Marlon probably has something really brilliant
That's
to
fine.
say.
That's fine.
We can create space. I'm fine if you're.
Are you fine?
Yes.
Okay, because I do want to make sure that we get to some suggestions
Yes.
and things like that.
Okay,
But go on where you were going.
I kind of lost my train of thought really quick, but I will bring this into it. Is that I wrote a piece on Color Lines today, and I said the title of the piece is "Coping is a Farce." And in the piece is that I'm sort of illustrating that when we as adults say we are coping well with these sort of things, I'm saying that I'm just sort of pushing forward the point. I don't think we really are, because of how easily we're triggered again when it happens again, and sadly it may happen again tomorrow or next week or later today. And that this country, and this is kind of going back to the president's comments, this country does a very good job of performing care, right? Acting as if it cares about what's happening. And so when I see the president's statements, I know him as Barry. You know what I mean? I know Barry cares, right? I know he cares. You know that? But because of the position he's in, and he's sort of loose when he said I'm under certain constraints because of this investigation. Those constraints, because you don't want to attribute guilt. He doesn't want to attribute guilt to any officer just yet, right? He said, because of my constraints and the DOJ investigation, I'll hold some things back. But ultimately, man, I admire him. I admire him as a Black man, as a Black person. I admire him in his position that he's in and what he's done to be, that he's there. But ultimately, and many times, and this is a critical assessment of him, is that he perpetuates that performance that we care in his role, in his position that this nation cares about what happens, and it's a harsh critique, but it's to me, as somebody who has seen these things over and over again. I'm somebody, a student of history. I know it's happened before. I was on this planet. I've seen these sort of things over and over again. I know he has. He's walked the same streets in New York City that I have. He wrote about it in his book, his first book at least. The performance only hurts us more. Right, that we care. When we saw the report, what happened after Ferguson, and that report, sort of brought to light things that people already knew, right? And yes, it'll happen again. And then eventually there'll probably be some report eventually that goes in here in Baton Rouge, and probably a report that'll go on in Minneapolis. And to me, those are just performances of like the shifting of responsibility of this problem needs to be where it is, and it is in that poisonous tree that I spoke about, is in the foundation of it. It is not necessarily in that we need to just sort of think about how can we build police-community relations, right? Our community views police a certain way for a very rational reason,
sure.
right? So when if folks feel tense when they see a cop, or they don't like it, I don't want to call, I don't trust, whatever it is, it makes sense.
Right.
It makes absolute sense. My question is, what is the rationale for the police rage? Because to me, because we aren't, as the media may put out at times, people aren't picking cops off in the streets. That's not happening. That's amusing. That's not happening. People aren't killing cops when people aren't targeting, beating up. Like, that's not happening in mass in this country. Surprisingly, it's not happening in this country, and it's a good thing that it's not happening. So like, what is the reason other than issues of race? Like, what are the reasons for this sort of acting out of rage towards us that happens, and in a very savage way, right? To see what happened to Alton Sterling a couple of days ago, it was savagery, right? It was almost as if he wasn't a person the way they dealt with him. With with Philando Castile, it wasn't human how after he was dead, you had a gun pointed at him as if he's some superhuman, as if like somehow Jesus is gonna find and resurrect this man, right? Like I'm pointing a gun at him, he's dead, he's limp, he's not moving, right? And you're still pointing a gun at him. There's a problem there. It's not the problem didn't lie with Philando. The problem didn't land with Alton. The problem lied in those people, those officers who perpetuated, and sadly so, whether it be, there's going to be, the unions will back them up. There will be an abundance of money from people around this country who will go to send money to this officer in his defense for his, for the legal case. Which speaks to that's a problem of this country. There's a quote, I don't have to quote exactly, seem like you, but James Baldwin years ago, somebody asked him, like, what do you think about, when we have our first Negro, at the term Negro president? And he said, it's not so much about what, when and how and who that first Negro president will be and what he'll be like. It's more so what kind of country will he be president of? Right. Yeah. And as we sit in this day and age, years past past Baldwin's passing on this planet, and we have this black president, and we have more visibility of the state violence, and to see that this country still will support, dismiss in many cases, excuse, rationalize, justify these murders of black bodies tells us something very pathological about this country. Right. So and one of the things about this country, that this country performs as if it cares, and it really doesn't care. So when that woman, and I empathize with her, and I'm not saying it's not bad. I'm happy that she's taking the courage to make that, Facebook post or whatever it is, to speak about, like, this is too much, and I see what you see. She's one person who definitely, there's other people I'm sure in her circle and in many police circles who have that same emotion, those same sentiments.
That she's just given permission to.
Right. But but she's given permission. But hopefully she's given permission to, because we don't know what repercussions come behind that.
We don't know what repercussions come from that, but we do know that when somebody steps out like that they do give other people permission to do the same. They do. It creates an opportunity. It's like, oh, maybe, in their spaces and places, they might get to try it. Right? So, sorry for interrupting.
That's fine.
I'm going to say this, though, like, right, so we have a black president. But the presidency is an institution, right? It's an institution. And one of the things that the Obama presidencies have done is called all that stuff out. Called out the racists.
He called it out, or we have?
When he became president, all of that stuff that was happening behind closed doors started coming out. Okay. And honestly, it cannot be addressed as long as it's operating in the shadows. You know what I mean? Like, Trump, all of that stuff, this is sort of I don't know if I can articulate it very well, but like that whole, it's necessary. It is necessary, not for people to die, but it is necessary for these jacked up, racist, crazy ideologies to be clearly articulated. I grew up in the North, but and my husband and I have this conversation about not like sort of what's worse, but that it's a different type of racism in the North. And I felt more comfortable when I lived in North Carolina because I knew that Confederate flag tells me a lot. Thank you, sir. I can govern myself accordingly. Versus in the North where people be like, oh, you're my best buddy. Come be the first black person in my club, la, la, la. And then they're scared to touch a doll because it's black, right? I felt safer when I could see the racism. It felt more like, okay, this, I can figure out how to do something with this. And I feel like with Obama as president, that's part of what's happened. It sucks. There really are no words for how disrespectful people have been and all of the ideologies that have come forth. But I think it's necessary to start to have these institutions do what you're talking about, which is no, don't rub that off on somebody else. Don't rationalize this to the unique individuals or this. The reality of it is white perpetrators live. Even in the midst of committing a heinous crime, that guy's gonna live. This black man over here getting his hustle on to take care of his family, he's gonna die. He hasn't killed one person. You can walk into church as a white man and kill 9 people and keep your life when the police come, right? These are the realities, and until they are called out and seen and labeled for what they are, there's only so far you can go. I can hear it, right? I'm grateful that the president, right, who knows what kind of conversations are happening behind closed doors and how frustrating that must be to know and to be able to get so far as to say, look, I'm constrained. There's certain stuff I just cannot say. I can't wait until January 2nd when somebody does an interview with Obama. Even then, maybe he might not be able to say, like, this is what's really real. But I do think we as a country have gotten a taste. And I hear what you're saying about performing care. It's not an easy fix. This is not something, it's what, generations, hundreds of years it is. It's not going to change it's not going to change overnight. It's just not. And a lot of what we've been talking about, a lot of what's happened up to now, it hasn't really gotten to like, what do we do about that Kool-Aid that, quite frankly, a lot of people are drinking? It's not just white cops that drink that Kool-Aid. Black and brown people have internalized ish of our own, related to race, related to class, related to gender, related to sexuality, right? And all of that is a part of this. Like, until we as collective and as individuals start to take responsibility for our hurts and the areas that we do need to heal, like, I saw something posted a while back about, like, you can't really say you're about black liberation and be homophobic.
No question.
Right? Or be classist. That all of these things are linked together. So when we talk about moving forward, and I will try to be more specific and not speak so like globally, that's a bit of a challenge, but at the individual...
Preach anyway, girl, go ahead.
at the individual level, I do think it starts with getting real and just acknowledging, this hurts. I'm angry, I'm pissed, I don't want to go to work today, like, I don't want to see a white person, I don't want to see a cop, like, just acknowledge that, notice it, don't wish it away, don't should it away. Don't should anybody away, like, honor that somebody else may have a completely different experience. There's some people who may not be able to tolerate the videos, some people may not even be able to tolerate the conversation. That's okay. Let them know, to each his own in terms of saying, ideally, like, you can't start to move forward, or, in my opinion, until you acknowledge it at some level. So at some point, at some place in time, acknowledging that you heard about it and what that stirred up is an important piece, just that acknowledgement. Managing your triggers, managing how much time you're spending on social media, looking at the daily news, having conversations with your friends, all of that is important. Acknowledging those thoughts, because what will often happen is you'll be thinking about things when you don't want to be thinking about them. You'll have images. It'll stir up for people their own personal traumas, for people whose loved ones have been killed in gun violence, people whose loved ones, I mean, this is just the last few years, but think about how many families have lost their loved ones to police officers, and every time this hits the news, it's stirring things up. To acknowledge that, to know that's why you're thinking about your loved ones, because you're being triggered again. To acknowledge the emotions, the sadness, as well as the anger, the fear, the helplessness, all of that. To notice your body. Like, for me personally, again, when we were in Mississippi, I could feel that I was a little bit tighter, a little bit more tense, a little less patient than I was earlier. Noting what that looks like for you, knowing when you need to go take a break, when you need to go have a coffee or a tea or whatever. That's at the individual level. At the couple level, at the family level, again, I think it's important to have conversations. So what are we going to do? Is there an organization that people can volunteer with? Are there Do they know? Do they have relationships with the people in government or with police officers? A lot of families have police officers or military or somebody in their family that may, if they've got questions, help me understand what this is about, and please don't tell me that's just a bad apple. Like, to really be curious with people. Because sometimes, honestly, some people who are really in positions of power and privilege don't even know it, that they have a space and a place that I know so-and-so who works for this precinct that actually is with the staff EAP person or what have you, or is actually could be responsible for having a conversation. Checking in with officers and understanding, like, this sister's stepping out on her own, but I'm wondering how many precincts could have a behind closed door conversations with all of their officers about, like, what does this stir up? What happens when you hear about these things in the news? What ideas do you have about how do we shift these things if no other place in our own precinct? So thinking about how can these triggers, images, emotions, physical sensations be managed in a community level? And then there is that policy piece. I don't know if there's much more than, I'm sure there's more. Let me not say that. I'm sure there's more that can be done, but because torture happens at a state level, at a federal level, those remedies need to come at that level as well. So for me, it's like, I think my concern is having this conversation that's really about a collective community trauma get narrowed down to, like, what this individual needs to do for themselves. It's beyond the individual. An individual taking care of themselves and managing self-care, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient.
Well, I'm going to say this, that I think that as an individual, one of the things I can say you don't do in terms of healthy behaviors and dealing with this is that I didn't eat until I said about 11 o'clock today, right? So that's definitely don't do that. Don't forget to eat. You need to do that. But here's the piece about, as we have suggestions, and you offered others too, but suggestions about, as we think about interpersonal and personal healing and ways to cope, and coping mechanisms, I should say, and healthy behaviors. Like, no matter how well I do that, right, and the people who are my immediate circle, there is still an institutional healing that needs to be happening, right? So no matter how much I heal, I still will be I'll still be triggered when something happens again, or when I don't feel like they are acknowledging this sort of, what I'm dealing with, this pain that we're dealing with collectively. And so on a national level, so there's specific policy, there are policies that can be had, right? There are policies that can be had that folks on a community level are in a space of suggesting, or what can be done to sort of like shift how we approach our justice system, criminal justice system as a whole, but also policing, right? And those things need to be in the sense of like in the spirit of like Ella Baker, like those folks on a community level have and need to have a stake in what policy looks like when it's eventually implemented on a state level. So there's no question, there are folks, including myself, who are in a space of suggesting these sort of things. One of the things, though, is that they need to be acknowledged as on the same level as folks who are not who don't have that sort of expertise, to say, in a political arena, right? They need to be held at the same weight. But I go back to the critique space again, because we gloss over. I had a friend that said to me, well, like, what's the solutions now? Like, what's the solutions, right?
Yeah.
And we jump into solution space, and I mentioned that they are there, and folks are continually working on that space of solutions. But the thing about the solutions piece, and when we ask people to jump to that right way, like, what do we do next in terms of changing this and fixing this, et cetera, is that we have not collectively acknowledged the core of why these problems keep reoccurring in this nation. Like we do at the root. Audience might do so, might acknowledge those sort of things, but the people who are in those positions of electoral position of power, for the most part, don't, or even dismiss it. Right? So we speak about our two presidential candidates. I don't know if either one of them has made a statement about what's happening, but I know as of yesterday, I had heard nothing from either one of them, right? They're talking about emails and all that sort of jazz. But we should be thinking about that, though. And at this time, we're just a few months from deciding who the next person in the White House will be. Not only where do they stand on these issues, okay, but do they feel compelled to take a stand on these issues personally?
Right.
Or is it just like after, somebody's going to be at a press conference eventually and push them to speak about it? Or are they like, well, this is how we approach this, this is an example of how we're going to approach these issues inevitably when they come up again when they are in office, because they're representing this institution now.
Right.
This institution that that's for the better part of this nation's life has dismissed us.
Right.
So will they continue to do this dismissal because we can't move into that place of solutions if the powers that be dismiss us?
Well, there needs to be that acknowledgement on an individual level for them, right, of their own racism.
Wait for Trump to do that.
Right, exactly, right? But in order, right, so it's what you're talking about is really the institutions taking responsibility. So I'll go back to the institution of policing. It's not clear to me that as an organization they have taken responsibility for the humanity and well-being of their police officers.
Absolutely not.
And those are things that actually corporate America knows a heck of a lot about. There are Fortune 500 companies here who invest a ton of resources in the mental health and social well-being of their employees. Why? Because they understand that it affects the bottom line. It's not my understanding that our public institutions, be they child welfare, be they policing, do that. Understand that at an organizational level, there are things that can be done to cultivate the humanity and well-being. Because if I'm not being treated as a human being by this institution, how am I going to be able to move into a community when unsafe things are happening and stay in that space where I'm able to facilitate and acknowledge the humanity and well-being of a citizen, of a community member? From a leadership perspective, that's why I come back to I don't think we can just write off privileged folks. They need to understand their own isms. Because until they acknowledge that, as long as those are those poor white people over there, or those police officers, or my family's corporate, or my family's from Europe, or those are people. That's when you get the all lives matters, because in their fear is, am I that racist? Am I this big humanitarian worker? Am I actually racist? Am I fundamentally that's where you get the Barbie? What was that? The Barbie savior. There was a whole Instagram thing where you have people going off to different parts of Africa posing. It's a really funny Instagram dream, right? Yeah. But those are people who don't understand that just by breathing the air of the United States of America, that they are fundamentally racist. I come from the school of thought of black folks can't be racist because we're black. And we don't have the power and the institutional resources to perpetuate systemic racism. And that the only people that really can do that are white folks. At the same time, I think that once people are sort of given the space to acknowledge that aspect of their humanity, that's when shift starts to really happen at those greater levels. That in some ways it does come back to the individual. And being able, I had a whole debate with somebody, and she was like, why should we care about that? And I was like, think of the difference it would make if Hillary Clinton said Black Lives Matter instead of All Lives Matter. Think about what kinds of space opened up and opportunities changed.
This year, by the way.
Well, that's a dismissal in our faces. That's a dismissal in our faces.
Yeah, right, because it's an election year. Right, but to be able for them to have somebody in their space that they're having meaningful dialogue with about let's just talk about that little micro moment that we had. Were you dismissed, or you said this, or this may not. I think one of the biggest things for some people is having a conversation about the difference between intention and impact. Because that's the way the dismissiveness often shows up, is I didn't intend that. That's not what I meant to say. That may not have been your intention, but this is the impact. And I need you to just honor and acknowledge and respect that this was the impact. When you say to a black woman, X, Y, and Z, that wasn't your intention to be micro, to dismiss my thoughts and feelings, to stereotype me. You don't know no better, boo-boo. You drank that Kool-Aid, you breathe this air, but if you would just give me the space to sort of educate you, and could you just acknowledge a little bit? And that's work. And that's work that we, as black people, get to make a choice about, am I going to do that today? Am I going to pick that up, or am I going to put that down? Because we will wear ourselves out trying to take on everything at all times and be in every place, every space, every protest. We need to find ways.
Yeah, we need to find places to take care of ourselves.
To be strategic about that.
And that's a good place to round out the conversation, if you guys will, to close out with suggestions and insight, which is what we're here for, on moving forward and also taking care of self.
I'll go first. I think as a clinician here, it'd be better if you got the final word.
Okay.
I think I mentioned some things earlier about things that you don't do, right? And for me, it's a struggle of ensuring that I take care of myself personally, and not overwhelming myself with these issues, which I have been doing. And I'll know intellectually that there's certain things I need to be doing to take care of myself, at least emotionally. And then I would sort of just like things would happen and I'll neglect and I'll just keep going and then running on fumes. I've had a great amount of support from friends and family, texting me, calling me, Facebook messaging me, and asking me if I'm taking care of myself. And I suggest that we do the same to other folks, to make sure folks are doing well and taking care of themselves and providing if we can, and if it's within our healthy space, to provide any support that we can to them, to those folks. I think with our young folks, and that's like one of my focuses with our young folks, we need to be measured in how much detail we give them about what's happening, depending on their age and being age appropriate with our things. But I also think that I think, you can add on to that, but I don't think we should completely shield our young folks from these things that are happening. I think they should have some understanding of what's happening in their surroundings. You may not want to, if you're able to not let them see them pictures, maybe you may not want to let them see those sort of graphic nature, but you may want, I think we should let our young folks have conversations with our young folks in an age-appropriate way about what's happening around them. And particularly in those spaces, and this is, folks in different states will be seeing it. So like folks in Minneapolis and folks in Baton Rouge out down south in Louisiana, where it's much more close to them in terms of distance. We need to be able to have conversations on a community level with those folks. Speak to people in our neighborhoods. Those young folks, it's summertime kids outside on the block hanging out. If we can, for those folks, like if we're able to engage them, if we're able and we feel we have the know-how to engage them in conversation about what's happening and how they feel about it, because they're the ones we need to be engaged. They're the ones who have more interactions with police than some of the older folks. So we need to be having these conversations with them. And the conversation is not this. It's not solely about, well, do you know your rights, how to interact with police? Like, it's sad that we have to do that to our young folks. That's one part of the conversation. But I'm always in the space of having feeling conversations with our young people. Like, how do you feel when you hear this? How do you feel about it? What is your reaction? Because oftentimes, our young folks are just reacting, and it's not in their best interest that they, in their own best well-being, that they just react that way. So engage our young folks on the blocks, the street corners, in your family, what have you. Engage them in a conversation about what's happening, because they're going to see it one way or the other, and we want to make sure that at least we have a connection to them.
Right. So you're helping me realize to slow down and just take a moment. So I'm going to pick up with the feelings piece, because I think we often talk about feelings and assume that we're all on the same page, and it's a tricky word. So I'll acknowledge that too. I think it's important to focus on feelings, and I'll be specific, emotions and physical sensations, because there is a difference. And for some of us, we're much more aware of what we're experiencing in our bodies than we are able to label a particular emotion. So creating that space for people to just articulate, whether it's a child or yourself, even if it's only to yourself, whether you're writing about it or speaking about it. Ooh, I'm furious, right? I feel furious, or I feel a rock in my chest, or I'm just tired, right? So acknowledging all of those things. What was it that triggered you? What are some of the images that are coming through your mind that you can't get through? It could be some of the images we're bombarded with by the media, but it could be the image of a loved one that you lost years ago, months ago, weeks ago, days ago, hours ago. So understand that it's connected, that there may be thoughts about yourself that you felt really up about something, and now all of a sudden you just are kind of like, okay, where's my passport? Like, is my passport valid? And what country can I get to where I feel safer and calmer, right? So just acknowledging those desires, those thoughts, those emotions, those physical sensations. I think that it's important to also honor and respect if you're closing, if you're just not in a space right now to take it in, if you're numb, if you're avoidant, if you don't want to talk about it. And I would encourage that if that's where you are, that you honor that and set a time, a space, or place to keep checking in with yourself, because that is something. these things can be so isolating that I think it is something that needs to be acknowledged at some point in time, that I think it's a setup to just avoid and go numb. It's a setup to be even more sort of debilitated when you finally do start letting things in. To have those conversations with families, to think about how do you talk about it with a 4-year-old, with a 14-year-old, when do you talk about it, and making sure that you honor your timeline for that. I think that's also important too. Being mindful of the shoulds. Are you judging somebody else because it's too hard to really sit with everything that's getting stirred up for you? Or are you judging yourself and your own reactions? Are you thinking something's off because you are numb, or because you flipped to watch Game of Thrones for the 5th time again, right? Just pay attention to all of that stuff. I think for people who are in institutions and have any sort of power, particularly folks who are a part of corporate but particularly policing institutions, if there are spaces and places where you can create having a conversation, what is going on? What are some of the thoughts that are, being in that space. Also thinking about what can you do locally that gets you in community, actively addressing these things in a way that is meaningful and doable. Start where you are. And respect and acknowledge that some people, the most thing that they have access to is their Facebook friends. And maybe they have witnessed something over the holiday that was kind of foul and kind of off. Have that conversation, label it, find a way to say it. They may not hear it, but that's a way of self-care, is to say, well, I know that I did something to take a stand and really address, as you said, the deeper issues, which are these isms and these ideas. With our children, I think we have to be protective and proactive. So while we're simultaneously giving the message that police may not be the safest people for you, we also have to say, well, what can you do in those moments, and create opportunities for them to role play, to be creative, to sort of be a part of that conversation in a meaningful way, and not just be receptors of all of our fear and angst and anxiety, just telling them what to do, but giving them a space to be creative and move about in that. So those are some of the to-dos that are immediately coming to mind. I'm sure all of us will continue to think about this even after our time together has ended. I will have to go back to some of the basic pieces of it, of like eating and sleeping, and really honestly that trigger management, because I think we have a habit in this country of binging on things, particularly given that we've got 24/7 and that some of us are not comfortable with having space in our schedules. But to really give yourself space where you're not constantly watching the TV or having it on in the background, or the radio on in the background, or the Facebook up and constantly scrolling through it. Shut it down for a minute, at least 15.
That's some good stuff. Nice and simple, but you guys really, you did a wonderful job at combing through these emotions and the trauma, and your expertise around that was really helpful. Marlon, your knowledge around, gun violence and the things that affect us as human beings, thank you for sharing on that. And thank you everyone for watching with us. We reached almost 1 million people with this, and I think that is a testament to where we are right now. We needed this. So I so appreciate you guys for tuning in on this special edition of The Root Live. Make sure that you are tuning in to us every week as we discuss the topics that are important to the Black community. Marlon and Dr. Nicholson Sullivan, do you guys want to share your social media for them to follow you or for them to reach you?
I don't have social media.
Get out of here!
I could be.
Tweet her.
Yes, I don't have it yet. I can be reached at melba.sullivan@gmail.com.
So that's very bold to share.
Your inbox.
But Marlon, they would love to reach you as well.
So you can be on Twitter at Marlon_79. That's the easiest way. Marlon_79 on Twitter.
MARLON_79 on Twitter. And if you go to the Roots Twitter account, you will see Marlon's Twitter handle being used for some of the things that he said, as well as some of the things that Dr. Nicholson Sullivan has said today. Thank you guys again. Make sure that you're tuning in tomorrow for Facebook Live, as we will have a chat with Black authors, which is just something that we were going to do, but we also have Mark Lamont Hill on that panel, and we know that he has written a book recently about...
Who else you got on there? I'm sorry. I'm interested.
We'll talk about that.
Oh, okay.
He has a book that's out right now called Nobody, that focuses on what it is to be a nobody in America, which is us. But I thank you guys so much for watching with us, and we'll see you tomorrow.